Okay, so chapter 9 continuing. It's 1969, 1970, the Beatles. Simon and Garfunkel split up. Dinah Ross and the Supremes go their separate ways. And so you have three of the biggest acts in rock music who effectively in 1970 are no more. So the question is who's going to come along to kind of fill in that void? And three of the biggest acts in certainly of the 1970s, but three of the biggest acts in rock history would come along at that time as well to take over from the fortunes that the Beatles and the Supremes and Simon and Garfunkel had held. Jackson 5 was one of them. Five brothers from Gary, Indiana. The youngest was a kid named Michael Jackson, who turned 12 years old in 1970. And the first record they released came out late in 69, and it was called I Want You Back. I Want You Back, Jackson 5, went all the way to number one, and they followed it up with another number one record called ABC. ABC, Jackson 5. They came out with a third number one record called The Love You Save, and the fourth number one record they had, four in a row, was later on in 1970, classic ballad, the biggest hit of the Jackson Five's career, in fact, called I'll Be There. Jackson 5. So Jackson 5 came around in 1970. Their first four records went to number one, and those would be the only number one records the Jackson 5 would have throughout their entire career. Michael, of course, on his own would score many more number one records, but as a group, the Jackson 5, who would later change their name to the Jacksons for contractual reasons, they never hit number one again. Four number ones in a row, and that was it. All right. Another enormously popular act that came around in 1970, a brother and sister team named Karen and Richard Carpenter, known as the Carpenters. Karen was a drummer who also, come to find out, was a vocalist of singular capacity. Richard was an arranger, an extraordinarily talented musician and arranger. And the two of them together, they complemented one another. The Carpenters' music came under a lot of criticism, even in its day, for being too soft, sort of middle of the road, bland. The bottom line is the Carpenters would go on to become the most popular American act of the 1970s. They would create some extraordinarily good music. And Karen Carpenter, then people thought Karen Carpenter was a really good singer. But now, 50 years later, Karen Carpenter is seen for what she was, a monstrously talented and influential vocalist, and ranks right up there as one of the great female vocalists in rock history. So let's pogo stick, give a listen to this Carpenter's classic, We've Only Just Begun. Karen and Richard Carpenter. One of the things that made Karen Carpenter so extraordinary as a vocalist is the fact that her range was lower. She was an alto, and she really mingled this kind of pop sound with something very much like the blues. You could picture Karen Carpenter singing the songs of Ella Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan and Billie Holiday. uh, tremendous vocalist. So Jackson 5 and the Carpenters both came around in 1970. Ultimately, in terms of popularity, longevity, they would be eclipsed by the man who was not only the biggest artist of the 70s amongst everybody, but was extremely popular in the 80s, 90s, and even up to now when a film about his life called Rocket Man earned a lot of money and a lot of praise over the past year. Elton John was a huge, huge, bigger than life star. And he would go on so that right now he sits at number 3 on the list of most popular rock stars of all time, behind only Elvis Presley and the Beatles. Elton John came around in 1970 with a classic ballad called Your Song. All right, we talked about Van Morrison earlier with Brown Eyed Girl, but 1970 gave us some more of this extremely talented Irish musician with a pop jazz hybrid classic, Moondance. This is Van Morrison. Great tune, great tune. Van Morrison, Moondance. Okay, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. We talked about them in relation to Woodstock, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were a consistently popular and consistently important act throughout the 1970s. But in 1970, they rose to an extraordinary challenge because on May 4th of 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, there were some student protests that were happening against the Vietnam War, or I should say, they weren't happening, they were planned. And word got to the college, to the university administration, that these protests were going to go on, that there was even talk that the students were going to take over the administration building. And the president did not want this to happen, did not want the university to be seen in this light, and ultimately called in the National Guard to help keep the protesters at bay. There was violence, there was misunderstanding, there was miscommunication, but more than anything else, there was a mistake. And the National Guard wound up firing into the students, killing 4, including, I believe, 1 bystander and 1 passerby. The difference being a bystander, somebody was standing there watching. A passerby was somebody who wasn't even, he was just kind of what. It was just, it continued the bitterness and the sadness of the time, and it did absolutely nothing but exacerbate the situation between the generations, especially between the younger generation and not just the generation of their parents, but the generation of authority, the military, the police, the establishment, the government. All of those things suffered in the eyes of the younger generation in no small part because of what happened at Kent State. And to this day, I will be honest with you, I don't know much about Kent State University other than this tragedy that happened there now 50, almost exactly 50 years ago as you watch this video. And I expect a lot of people from my generation are in the same boat. And I'm sure that this is a stigma that the university has to deal with to this day. It was just one of those tragedies that was just another blemish on this time period in American history. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young memorialized the not just those who were taken from us, but the event itself in a song called Ohio. Crosby, Stills. All right, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Ohio. In rock and roll, I think I said this before, that the Rolling Stones are the most direct link between the blues and the music that would ultimately come to be known as rock and roll. And that if there was anybody who could be considered kind of in the same breath with the Stones, it was Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin started out in the late 60s, but they hit as rock gods in 1970. And they were that. They played a combination of blues music, straight up rock and roll, with just enough metal, just enough edge and danger. The music was extraordinary. When Led Zeppelin was good, there were few bands that could touch them, and I'd make the argument that that's still the case. It was actually difficult, only narrowing it down to only four, but these are songs that really characterized Led Zeppelin at their finest in 1970-71, Dazed and Confused. Listen to this song and think about the blues, because that's exactly what this song is. Led Zeppelin, Dazed and Confused. Now, Robert Plant was the lead singer of Led Zeppelin, extraordinary vocalist. Jimmy Page was the guitarist. Plant and Page would sort of join Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and John Lennon and Paul McCartney as sort of the great twosomes of rock and roll. One of Led Zeppelin's big hits on the radio was from the album. Was it from Led Zeppelin 4? I think it was. It was from Led Zeppelin 4. Whole Lotta Love. Straight ahead guitar rock, but classic. Immigrant Song, another Led Zeppelin classic that shows yet another sort of flavor in their toolkit. Immigrant Song, crazy. Stairway to Heaven, you have to include it because it is the song that is most closely identified with Led Zeppelin, especially by fans who know nothing about Led Zeppelin. Um, it's it's an amazing piece of music. It really is, with what I would argue is one of the finest guitar solos ever put on vinyl. Um, Stairway to Heaven was 8 minutes of a beautiful ballad that was done with sort of a medieval flair, that kind of almost Gregorian, not quite Gregorian chant, but more of a medieval flavor of music. And then they had this extraordinary, Jimmy Page did this just drop dead guitar solo in it. And Stairway to Heaven got a lot of radio play. And a lot of people think Stairway to Heaven was a huge number one record, but Led Zeppelin never released Stairway to Heaven as a single. So it never hit number nothing because it was never on the singles chart. So Stairway to Heaven is one of those classic album tracks. So let's give a quick listen, quick 8 minute listen to Stairway to Heaven. Led Zeppelin. All right, we'll leave it at that, and I will see you on the other side.